Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today we are back doing the best books I read in 2024. This video came out a little bit later than I normally do it, but I did read some great books in the past year, and so I want to talk about them. Like last year and the year before that, these books will be presented in no particular order, except for the final three, which, like in the past 2 years, I deem my holy trinity of the books I read in the past year. So, first off, in a book that I read early on this year, Gustave Flaubert in Egypt. I'm sorry, I'm trying to pronounce it right, but I am not French, as you can clearly tell. Flaubert. I'm just gonna say Flaubert. I'm sorry. Just let it know for the snobs out there that I made an attempt to say it right. But Flaubert in Egypt is his travel diary / letters that he wrote while traveling in Egypt for a long period of time. Flaubert is, of course, the writer of Madame Bovary and many other famous French novels. But this diary comes very early on in his career, where while he's traveling, he starts writing about the ideas he's getting for Madame Bovary and books like that. So you get a young Flaubert, young academic, very intelligent, and also a writer by this point, traveling through Egypt with his friends. And you also get who themselves are very accomplished publishers and writers for their time. You get all their stories as they're these kind of rich kids traveling around in Egypt. And what's most commendable, I guess, about the book is Flaubert. He talks a lot about the history and the rich culture of Egypt, but at the same time, he's not really afraid to talk about the dark side, the nightlife of the time that he's living in the cities that he visits. So you get some really good descriptions of, like, say, brothels and things like that, which, I mean, if you really want to get a good idea of what these places in Egypt are like at the time in which Flaubert was living and what young rich people were doing when they were traveling here, this is pretty much a perfect book for you. And Flaubert is just such a talented writer. I should also include that this is the first Flaubert I've ever read in my life, and I was blown away by the prose, even though it's probably not as thought over as his actual novels. I was very impressed by the way he describes different cities in Egypt at night, morning, middle of the afternoon, the temples, the pyramids, what have you. It just gives you such a great idea of what's going on. And his friends, too, they have wit to themselves as well. They're not afraid to throw barbs at each other and things like that. So it's a very human book as well. Flaubert is kind of a crazy person in real life, and I think that the diaries don't shy away from that, unlike Benjamin Franklin, his autobiography. But it's a video for a different time. However, I did quite enjoy this book, and as someone who loves traveling and someone who wants to read more travel diaries, because when I travel myself, I do like to write about what I'm doing every day. It was just very inspirational in a lot of ways. Next up, I have The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. This is a book award winner. Don't be misled by the cover. This book is very dark at times. It follows the first person perspective of a narrator who, I don't know anything about Sigrid, but I'm willing to make a leap that there may be some comparisons between the narrator's experiences and her experiences. I have no idea, because it's the narration feels very realistic. But it's this woman whose husband has just passed away, and he died from suicide. He was a relatively accomplished writer and academic, but he took his own life. And he also had several wives before the narrator, and so they're like wife 1, wife 2, wife 3 are all characters, and they're just called wife 1, wife 2, wife 3. But he had this Great Dane who is not old, but he's lived quite a few years at this point, so he's not a puppy anymore, and it's up to the narrator to take the dog in because no one else really wants it. So it's a story a lot about loss, about accepting that her husband, I think it was her boyfriend actually, her boyfriend wasn't really the greatest person in the world. He had his moments, and he was flawed, and sometimes his flaws were good intention, but, you know, he was unfaithful to his wives. He definitely had a high opinion of himself and put his work above everything else. So the narrator's very complex thoughts of, like, feeling bad for him because he, took his own life, but at the same time coming to terms with his own flaws and how he may have made her a worse person as well, was all very interesting. And also, the narrator is a writer herself, and she pulls so many quotes from, and so many like life experiences from different authors, such as like a German author who, with his girlfriend at the time, they just completely fell into despair and took their own lives because they just saw life as being completely meaningless. So again, that balance of hope and despair, what's the meaning of life, and just her ability to draw from different people from across the world, from across time periods. It was made for a very light but interesting read. I blew through it in just a couple of days because it's a very short book, but ultimately a very enlightening one, and one I will see myself coming back to because, again, it's so short, but it's also so compact and so impactful for the page count it has. And I'm not surprised that it won the book award because I found it to be very insightful. Next up, I have Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. I was doing my Thomas Pynchon, Project Pynchon series this year. I read this over the summer, actually. I just never made a video on it. And so with regards to Project Pynchon, I'm thinking which one of my reading goals this year is to finish up the last 3 books I have for him, is just to make like a Pynchon ranking video, and that will be like the culmination of that series. But Mason and Dixon is a very good book. If you've read Pynchon before and haven't read this one, if I told you it's Pynchon talking about the early days of the United States as it leads into the Revolutionary War, it's both exactly what you think and nothing at all what you think, which is kind of the power of Thomas Pynchon. It's historical fiction, but with a Pynchonian twist, it doesn't really lose his own unique style. It's not his strongest work, in my opinion. I need to reread it because I think I'll get more out of it on a reread, because I think Harold Bloom said it's his best work. Don't quote me. I think he said that, but for what it was, I thought it was very impactful, and it gets better as it goes along. But again, very complex as well. It follows Mason Dixon, and Pynchon goes into so much detail about cartography and about their kind of work that they're doing. So there's a huge technical aspect to what's going on as well that I think on a first viewing, as someone who knows no idea about making maps, maybe something I couldn't really appreciate right now, but it's another book I want to revisit. I did read Vineland this year as well, and I just didn't find it to be anywhere near satisfying, which is why it's not in this video. But Mason Dixon was a very good book, and considering its length, it was a very easy read and quick read as well. Next up, I have Funny and Farsi by Fizuri Dumas. So if you don't know, my girlfriend is from Iran, and she got this book for me for my birthday. It's something that she read in Farsi, or in Persian, which is funny because the book specifically says that calling the Persian language in English Farsi is like speaking to a Spanish person and saying, I'm not fluent in Espanol, so saying I'm not fluent in Spanish. So I'm just going to call it Farsi because this is easier for me. But it's just the memoirs of this woman as she's growing up in the U.S., specifically in the California region, as the daughter of immigrant parents, and serving as like the translator for them with her teachers in school as this young girl, and also how the meaning of being Iranian changes throughout her life. So when she first gets there in the U.S. and she's in school, no one really knows where Iran is. Even the teachers don't really know where exactly she's from. But as the revolution happens and Iran starts becoming international, starts making international headlines, the meaning of being Iranian changes, and it reflects how the students look at her as well. So through no fault of her own, the perception of who she is changing based on world events that are completely out of her control. This isn't to say that this book is completely depressing, because it goes on a lot of details about like funny cultural differences, like how hospitable the Iranian people are, how they love to cook and they can cook all day, which I know from experience is a thing that they do. They will literally be cooking all day, and the food is the best cultural food I've had, save the fact that I'm from Italian origin, so Italians are just a little better for me. But Iranian food is amazing, and just a book that, because I'm somewhat acquainted in this world, I was able to laugh at because of the similarities that Dumas is drawing, but also completely opened my mind and showed me new aspects that I was unfamiliar with. So it's a very fun and insightful read. Next up, I have Roads in the Hellenistic Age by Richard Berthold. You might be asking why I would read such a niche book, and that will be revealed probably in a couple of years, realistically speaking. But the book warns you right at the start, saying this is a purely academic read, so if you don't have any prior knowledge on roads in the Hellenistic Age, you probably won't enjoy it. I can safely say that's not true, because I found this book to be quite riveting. I think Berthold is a very great storyteller on top of being a very insightful historian. Like, for example, for a book I'll be talking about later on, there aren't as many like memorable characters. For example, Rhodes itself is a very interesting character, and how it was like this like the Don, the godfather of the Aegean region, and the decisions that Rhodes makes. First of all, it's inner civil wars at the start that lead to being like this like idealized democracy, to its eventual selling out to the Roman Empire because they realize in order to preserve themselves, we have to conform. So Rhodes itself is kind of like the character, and the character evolution is fascinating. Bertold is a great historian, and I really want to read more of what he's done because for such a niche subject, he makes it extremely approachable. Speaking of the other history book I was just alluding to, Persian Fire by Spider-Man Tom Holland. That joke has never been made before. It's a pretty interesting book, I would say, because, I mean, Holland isn't a historian, as far as I'm aware. He is someone who's very passionate about history. But with that being said, I did learn a lot while reading this book. He is more of a writer, so a lot of the battle scenes are very descriptive. He does a lot of character building for people such as Leonidas. And even though I was somewhat acquainted with this subject matter, he goes a lot into like the propaganda, like what the Persians were thinking at the time. A really epic builds up to like the reign of Darius and how he came into power initially in Persia, and then how he was different from his successor his successor Xerxes, and what the meaning of this war between the Greek city-states and Persia meant for both sides. It's a very great book, and for someone who's knowledgeable but not very well read on the subject, I found it to be like the perfect stepping stone into probably more dense works. Next up, I have Geronimo's biography. Kind of a random choice, but it was free on my Kindle, so here I am talking about it because I do want to read more about the American West, and I was like, Geronimo is one of the most iconic figures from that time period, so why not go for that? So here I am, and it's a very interesting autobiography, very short. Again, it's free, but it gives you a lot of insights on what life was like for Native Americans at the time, completely unfiltered by like colonizer. At least I think unfiltered by colonizers and by the U.S. at the time publishing it. I'm fairly certain it's completely Geronimo's own work and nothing else, except someone wrote it for him. Besides that, but there's very interesting insights, and the way he goes into depth about Apache culture, like the chain of command, the religion, what their purpose is as they're slowly dying out to this unstoppable force that is like the U.S. government and its westward expansion, the constant moving around, the feeling that not feeling, but the fact that they are being thrown out of their homes, a lot of times massacred. But Geronimo lived a very violent life, and just seeing like him as an old man reflect on all the battles he fought, and to kind of come to the conclusion that no matter how hard he fought, it didn't really end up mattering in the long run. But in the meantime, there are some pretty epic battle descriptions. I'm going to read one right now because it kind of reads like the Native American version of like a Homeric poem. So I'm going to read a section because it's pretty gruesome, but just also very elegantly written at the same time. This comes like from a younger Geronimo, after his first wife and his family and his first wife, his baby, and his parents are all massacred by Mexican soldiers. Him and the survivors of the Apache go and seek revenge, and I'll read the section as followed. In all the battle, I thought of my murdered mother, wife, and babies, of my father's grave and my vow of vengeance, and I fought with fury. Many fell by my hand, and constantly I led the advance. Many braves were killed. The battle lasted about 2 hours. At the last, 4 Indians were alone in the center of the field, myself and 3 other warriors. Our arrows were all gone, our spears broken off in the bodies of the dead enemies. We had only our hands and knives with which to fight, but all who stood against us were dead. Then 2 armed soldiers came upon us from another part of the field. They shot down 2 of our men, and we, the remaining 2, fled toward our own warriors. My companion was struck down by a saber, but I reached our warriors, seized the spear, and turned. The one who pursued me missed his aim and fell by my spear. With his saber, I met the trooper who had killed my companion, and we grappled and fell. I killed him with my knife and quickly rose over his body, brandishing his saber, seeking for other troopers to kill. There were none. But the Apache had seen. Over the bloody field, covered in the bodies of Mexicans, rang the fierce Apache war whoop. Still covered with the blood of my enemies, still holding my conquering weapon, still hot with the joy of battle, victory, and vengeance, I was surrounded by the Apache braves and made war chief of the Apaches. Then I gave my orders for the scalping of the slain. I could not call back my loved ones. I could not bring back the dead Apache, but I could rejoice in this revenge. The Apache had avenged the massacre of Kaz-Ki-Ye. Just, breathtaking storytelling here, and from a man who lived a truly, truly unique, tragic, but also at the same time kind of epic life. Next comes up, and to conclude my best books of the year before I get to my Holy Trinity, Malcolm Cowley, Exile's Return. I snuck this one in right before the end of the year, and I'm so glad I did, because if you're any way at all familiar with this, with my channel, you'll know that I talk endlessly about expat fiction, specifically The Lost Generation. 2 years ago, I read Sylvia Beach and The Lost Generation, and I have Joyce all here, I have Fitzgerald all here, I have Hemingway here. I love the subject matter. I have Gaddis here. I love the subject matter so much. I have Henry Miller right here. I can never get enough of it. Exile's Return, in many ways, feels like a book that should be read well after you're accumulated with expat fiction, specifically of The Lost Generation, because Malcolm Cowley, like Joyce, like Fitzgerald, although he was on the younger side after World War I, where he served as an ambulance driver, like Hemingway and Hart Kane, he just felt completely disassociated with what was going on in the U.S. and having to replicate the style of The Wasteland, and feeling like art had stagnated, decides to go to Paris with all these other aspiring and bold and reckless artists. Unlike a lot of them, Cowley, when everyone had to return home, was able to make a career for himself and find fulfillment in what he was doing back in the U.S. And to be able to track, from his perspective, like all these writers, trying to find fulfillment abroad and using alcohol and travel and the thrills that come with traveling, and just like insane, completely unique art, as it kind of fizzles out over time and just leaves the people feeling empty. And unfortunately for people like Hart Kane, who are brilliant in their own right, can't bear with it and, take their own lives. But in the meantime, he talks a lot about the meaning of art and the meaning of The Lost Generation. Specifically, Dadaism, which is the religion of the artist. It's a more extreme version of the religion of the artist, where, again, as I was saying, writers and other artists are no longer adhering to tradition, and they're just doing their own thing. And so you get brilliant works of art, which Cowley praises, like Ulysses, which is right here. Sorry, Cicero. But over time, the artists become a little too self-absorbed, which is like the whole basis of the religion of the artist, and they lose their humanity. He actually talks about Flaubert, even though Flaubert is in this time period, but he says Flaubert became so into himself and so detached from reality and so obsessed with his own art that while having sex with prostitutes, he would make a bet where he would say he could smoke a cigarette the whole time. So, like, the lack of, the dehumanization of people who aren't artists that comes from Dadaism, that comes from religion of the artist, it was also fascinating because, and he has evidence to back it up because he, again, citing Joyce, Ulysses was this amazing work of art that completely blew away artists and, the common reader alike. It wasn't trying to adhere to tradition. It was kind of a little mean-spirited in a way, but also very human. Following it up with Finnegan's Wake, so again, he gets all this praise and all this attention, and then he's like, how do I top that? Finnegan's Wake, which Malcolm Cowley calls like a crossword puzzle. It lacks the humanity, he's saying, that Ulysses has, and that's why it's not as well remembered. It's just complicated for the sake of being complicated. And then he draws other comparisons to other writers as well. It's just a very philosophical book, and one that's like if we had the iceberg theory of like expat writers, I would say Exile's Return is well underwater. And I'm glad that I've read so much about expat fiction before getting to this book, because even though it's a time period that I'm fairly familiar with, it was just a very enjoyable read, and it further elevated my understanding of the genre and what it means to be a writer. And now we're on to my Holy Trinity, starting off with a book that I picked up because, well, first of all, this book and the last book and the Roads and Hellenistic Age, I should also mention, were given to me by Drunzo. So the running theme of this Best Books of the Year list is that Drunzo really understands what I like. So thank you. Poet's Pub, one of the original Penguin classics. I went to Europe this summer, and I just wanted like a smaller book to have with me while I was on the airplane, while I was on the trains and whatever, just something to pick up and read. And oh my god, I completely fell in love with this book. It's written by Eric Linklater, who's a Scottish writer, and it follows Saturday Keith, who is the son of this Scottish soldier and, like, you know, aristocrat, and his wife, who they had a child on every single day of the week. So he's Keith, he was born Saturday, so therefore he is Saturday Keith. He is this aspiring writer who isn't particularly talented. Actually, Linklater writes some hilarious poems by him that are purposefully bad, and it takes talent to write a great poem, but it takes even more talent to write a purposefully bad poem, and these poems are purposefully bad. And so his poet career isn't really working out, but he's given the Pelican Pub, and we're just in Oxford, we're a bunch of different academics in different fields like science, literature, history. They all assemble, and old and young, domestic and abroad, and they all have these funny but also intellectual conversations at the same time. It's a delightful read, but it's also intelligent. I've said in previous videos that I don't really like reading like passive books, but here it's an enjoyable read, but it's also the intelligence to make it as witty as it is, make it as funny as it is just no doubt a tremendous talent on behalf of Linklater. There's so many like little funny scenes. For example, Joan, who is the daughter of a professor who comes to the Pelican's Pub, she is going to go on a date with Saturday Keith. They're going to go golfing together, and in order to prepare for the date, she's an artist, and she draws pictures of herself in different dresses to see how she would look, as opposed to just putting them on in the mirror. So little quirky things like that I think are cute. But just such an enjoyable read, and one that I really couldn't get enough of as I was reading it. It's so unique because I don't really read books for humor and for lightness, but here it just, like, the characters are so interesting, and there's just so many chapters dedicated to just pub banter, so it bounces from table to table, and you listen to all these like unique, kind of dense characters just, you know, talking their game, and it's very enjoyable. Also, I have Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I just made a video on it, so if you want my full thoughts on Hyperion, I suggest watching that video. It has some spoilers in it as well, but I'm trying to dip my toe more into science fiction, and I really couldn't think of a better book to do that, because it is a very, like, thematically deep book, but also, like, the lore of this galaxy that Dan Simmons has created is very interesting as well. Roughly speaking, because the plot's too detailed, and this video is has gone on for too long already, but it follows 7 pilgrims in a Canterbury Tales-esque way as they land on the planet Hyperion to go to the Time Tombs to meet with the Shrike, who is this, like, barbed metal monster, and on their voyage, each of the pilgrims tells their tale, a very unique sci-fi tale all to themselves, and with each tale they reveal the relationship with the Shrike. And for a legendary monster that it's being hyped up as being it feels like an insurmountable foe, and that's like the greatest thing I can say about Hyperion, is that the Shrike, the main antagonist, the more you learn about it, the more monstrous it becomes, and the more, like, unfathomable it becomes as well. So it's a very amazing read. Dan Simmons is incredibly well read. He draws comparisons to, again, Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, John Keats' Hyperion, and each of the Pilgrims is unique. They like one's a noir cyberpunk story, one's like a military story, one's about a writer as he takes part in this colony on Hyperion that's supposed to be like the safe haven for writers and other artists. It's just a book that kept me surprised throughout, and I'm 1/3 of the way through the sequel to Hyperion right now, and it's just as enjoyable. And last and certainly not least, the best book I read this year. I did it. Gravity's Rainbow. It's actually the first book I finished this year, and it took me a very long time. I did a video on it as well, but it's a book that just surpasses like one person talking about it. Thomas Pynchon is an author who I have very complex feelings about. For example, I read V, didn't like it. I read Vineland, didn't like it. However, Pynchon is the only author so far that has made it in my Holy Trinity 2 years in a row. Crying a Lot 49 was in my Holy Trinity last year, and now Gravity's Rainbow is in it this year. So I don't know what I think about Thomas Pynchon, because part of me loves him, and part of me finds him to be incredibly flawed. Not flawed, but not above criticism like some people hype him up to be. But Gravity's Rainbow is just like this completely unfiltered, but also very cohesive novel at the same time. I do like Crying of Lot 49 a little more. That might be heresy, but Gravity's Rainbow is just one of the most unforgettable books anybody can ever read, and it's a book that I can't even describe because I wouldn't even know where to begin. So that is going to sum up my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what your favorite books are of 2024 and what you're excited to read in 2025, because I'm going to be making 2025 goals, I think, very shortly. And so we'll get more into that as time goes on. For a little bit of business, I did publish another book. It's called Nothing Profound. It's a collection of short stories, and I'll leave a link in the description below if you're interested in checking it out. If you do buy it, I would really appreciate if you left a review as well, because the reviews do help me out tremendously. And also, Film Frauds with Tyler. You know him as Colorless Wonderland. We're doing a modern classic series, and I love doing this podcast, and I wish you would check it out as well. So I will see you in the next video. Thank you, and goodbye.